So, I did my presentation on dysgraphia and how it may affect somebody who is deaf and also has dysgraphia. So we're going to delve into that. And before I explain what dysgraphia is, I wanted to show this writing sample. It looks like maybe a 6-year-old did it. There's a lot of misspelling, there's random spacing, a lot of scratched out random stuff that doesn't even look like letters in it. But let me read you what it says. It says, "Hi, Robin asked me for a sample of my handwriting because I have dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is a term for learning disabilities that affect spelling and handwriting. I should probably point out that despite how my handwriting looks, I'm 26 and have a business degree from UPEI with a minor in economics." So that's just to show you what we're dealing with here. And dysgraphia, as they said, is predominantly a writing disorder. People think of it as, well, I guess people don't think of it, not a lot of people know what it is, but if you Google it, all that comes up really at first is that it affects handwriting and spelling, writing in general. But there's a little more to it than that. The writing side does include difficulty spelling with grammar and syntax, there may be spaces in the middle of words, random symbols that don't look like letters. They may take a very long time to get out a sentence. I saw a lot of writing samples where it was maybe 2 sentences and they took, 20 minutes to do it, things like that. Just general unintelligible penmanship, it's just extremely messy. It looks like a child did it. And it can be with handwriting only, or it can also be with writing, creating in general. That means typing, coming up with stories, things like that, comprehension, and mainly just putting ideas and concepts into words. And I would say verbalizing your thoughts, but it also goes through to writing, signing, all of that, just creating. It can also affect motor functions, which is a big point in deaf plus dysgraphia. Motor functions are obviously very important, but one of the main things is impaired finger sequencing, which is basically the muscles in your fingers and your hands. Depending on the type of dysgraphia, it can vary a lot, but you may have weak hand muscles. It may even be painful to write. The muscles you need may just clench up in an arthritis-like fashion. Maybe your hands are just very awkward and it just feels weird and awkward to write or to sign. So that greatly affects people who are deaf with dysgraphia. And I also thought it was worth a mention. It's referred to as dysgraphia mainly, but in adults it is referred to as agraphia. Dysgraphia is the condition in children, which also applies to like dyslexia, alexia, though we don't really talk about that. And also dyslexia and dyspraxia and dysphagia, they are all tied in together. It's very rare that somebody just has dysgraphia. So this is just a short video I'm going to show the beginning of. This is a girl who is not deaf, but she has dysgraphia. This is her TED Talk explaining how it affects her life. Oh Lord.
But I would like to change that today. Throughout elementary school, I always struggled with my academics. I was always just told that I wasn't trying hard enough, but everything finally made sense when I was diagnosed harder, and it also affects everyday things. Say you're reading a book. It might take you 2 minutes to read a page. Well, it would take double the time for someone with dysgraphia to read that same page.
So that was just a little bit about her experience. Mainly what I wanted y'all to hear is that it's not just a writing disorder. Like she said, it affects memory, comprehension, sequencing, a lot of things that affect your everyday life. Alright, so there are a few different types of dysgraphia. First would be pure dysgraphia, which refers to, as she said, the textbook definition. Trouble spelling, writing. There's probably not a lot of comprehension issues, probably no difficulty reading. But after that, there are the three much more common types of dysgraphia. And they're not mutually exclusive. You can have any combination of the three, probably in different levels. The first would be dyslexic dysgraphia, which is a type of dyslexia. And that is more the comprehension issue, trouble reading, trouble distinguishing letters, things like that. And then there's motor dysgraphia, which deals more with the motor side, obviously. The hand functions are probably impaired in some way, and probably not just that. It goes quite closely with DCD, probably not a lot of coordination, all of that. And then the third type is spatial dysgraphia, in which people have probably poor depth perception. Their letters may be very large and then very small, the writing goes off the page, things like that. So any combination of the three, probably most people with dysgraphia have all three to some extent. And then there is a difference between developmental and acquired dysgraphia. There is not a lot of research on this topic, which shocked me, but there was also a lot of conflicting information. The first page of Google I found those results to not be very reliable. The very reputable sources I found, the scholarly sources, all say there is developmental and then there's acquired dysgraphia. The first sentence on the Wikipedia page says dysgraphia is an acquired learning disability, ... and that's just not true. You can acquire it through brain damage to the left hemisphere, but I think most people are born with it. They grow up with it. Maybe it's not diagnosed until later, but that's what that is. Now, being deaf and having dysgraphia is a whole new ballgame. Starting with the diagnosis. Now, we all know ASL is not a written language, and the main criteria for diagnosing dysgraphia is discrepancies between what is spoken and what is written, both in English and America. And for a deaf child whose first language is ASL, if they have all the symptoms of dysgraphia, it's probably just written off as being deaf and English not being their first language and all of that. So they would never be properly diagnosed, which is probably why I found absolutely zero information or research on deaf people with dysgraphia. And another factor in diagnosing dysgraphia is their attitude towards writing. If a child just really doesn't want to write, wants nothing to do with it, they just avoid it, that's a sign that they might have a lot of trouble with it, more than the average child. And obviously if you're deaf and you're learning English, it's probably makes sense that they just don't want to write, don't want to deal with it. It's not their language. And that's for a child who grew up signing. For somebody who didn't, they probably don't have total communication, in which case they're going to have language issues anyway. And then the other factor is motor skills and pain in hands. So that probably for any deaf person who has dysgraphia, they're probably misdiagnosed because of that pain, and it's never dealt with properly. This is just a writing sample. This is by a deaf 8-year-old, I believe. It's a poem, and this 8-year-old does not have dysgraphia, but it just really looks like a hearing person who did. They probably would have been diagnosed, and I just want to read you the first couple of sentences. Boy walk see to cat, say meow. He pet to cat. Boy walk to but balloon said help. Me boy here to balloon boy climb. Now, some more demands of being deaf and having dysgraphia are, first of all, difficulty putting concepts into words. That's not necessarily a writing issue, that's a language issue, and no matter what language you're speaking or signing, it's going to come into play. So if you have difficulty putting thoughts into words or signs, that's a problem. Another one is finger spelling. If you have trouble spelling on paper, you're going to have trouble spelling with your hands. So finger spelling is a big part of ASL. It's going to cause some problems. Comprehension issues also, trouble receptively seeing finger spelling and understanding, things like that. And then writing to communicate with non-signers. In order to communicate with the hearing world and people who don't sign, it's pretty important to be able to figure it out somehow, and a lot of people do that by writing in English. If you can't do that and you don't speak the language of the world around you, it's going to be very hard to get by in the hearing world. It's going to affect their lives very greatly. Now, this is a clip I just wanted to show you the beginning of. This is a hearing ASL student who has dysgraphia signing about her dysgraphia. And in the beginning, I want you to watch, she finger spells her name, and then she finger spells dyslexia and dysgraphia. Just notice. So she did misspell her name twice, and she did misspell dysgraphia, and it looked like she just gave up on it and didn't even want to do it anymore. And that could be just because she's a beginning ASL student, but that I think is an accurate representation of what fingerspelling with dysgraphia would look like. It'd be very, very difficult and take a lot of thought and focus. So, some of the demands of interpreting for a deaf consumer with dysgraphia. I came up with a few possible demands, but it all boiled down to the same controls, which were, number one, talk to the consumer before you start interpreting, get a feel for their language, get a feel for what they may have trouble with, and talk with them and figure out a way to work through that while you're interpreting, while it matters. And then another control would be to bring in a CDI, especially for somebody whose language is very poor or very limited. CDI might be able to better get through to somebody who has trouble putting their concepts into words or signs. They may be able to better understand that person, so that's something to think about. But some of these demands were if they have poor comprehension, or if you in turn have poor comprehension, you can't understand what they're saying. Those are both going to come into play, obviously, so it's best to figure out a way to get through that before you start interpreting and work it out with them. At least get a feel for how they sign and, I don't know, match it and figure out, how that's going to work. And then feedback, will they be able to let you know if there's a problem, and will you be able to let them know if there's a problem? So you need to be ready to ask for clarification when in doubt. If there's any written information involved, should you interpret that as well? Maybe figure out a signal or something so that they know that they need some additional information from you. And let's see, for the role of the interpreter, I don't think this changes at all. Our main role as interpreters is not really an interpreter necessarily, it's as a communication facilitator. And that's going to look different no matter what the job is. It depends on the individual, where they come from, who they are, what they're doing. It's always going to be different, and we just have to adapt to that. That's our job. I don't think our role changes because we may have to, we may have to sign bigger, or, for lack of a better word, enunciate, or slow down our finger spelling or repeat things, and we're going to have to figure out the needs of all our consumers and do some of those things anyway. So no, I don't think our role changes. You're just there to facilitate communication and make sure everyone's heard at the end of the day. Some intrapersonal demands, though, would be how much do you interpret to figure that out, how to facilitate communication effectively without doing the consumer a disservice, without overcompensating or anything like that, and how to empower the consumer, again, without overcompensating, figuring out what they need and what they're comfortable with, and being there to provide it. There may also be some added pressure just because it's something you may not be comfortable with or familiar with. But like I said, that's the same with every job. There's always going to be pressure. There's always going to be something that's different that we have to adapt to. You can learn more about dysgraphia at these websites. They're on your handy-dandy handout of my PowerPoint and my citations. Thank you so much.